Ben Wheeler is going to talk about something that is largely to do with type 1 diabetes. And Ben is, I think as many people here will know, he is a professor of pediatrics in the University of Otago. He is also a consultant pediatrician with a long-standing interest in diabetes and endocrinology more broadly. But his particular contribution recently has been around the use of technology in type 1 diabetes. So Ben, look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thanks so much, Jim. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Ko Ben Wheeler toko ingoa. Greetings to you all. Real pleasure to be here. My passion is in using and advancing diabetes technology to improve outcomes for people with type 1 diabetes, but we're also experimenting in type 2 as well. And I guess along that journey, as we've been working on providing evidence for that, we've sort of, I guess, stumbled into equity issues that we've then become passionate about how we progress. And I think we're making some really nice progress, as a community in New Zealand, but I'll highlight a few gaps that are still there and hopefully some areas where we can still make a huge difference. So I think we're well beyond proving that at the moment, in the absence of immunotherapies and other things that might provide hope in the future, that technology really is the gold standard for how we manage type 1 diabetes and I guess can be applied into type 2 in many areas as well. I do need to note that I have many disclosures there, but I think that's all relevant when you work in the space and the gear costs so much. You need lots of partners. And I'd always be a little nervous if anyone who talks in this area who can't put any disclosures up, would be my opinion. I'm very passionate in improving care for all people, but I've got a particular interest in youth and young adults, and I really like this photo. This is Leonard Thompson. He, I guess, epitomizes sort of youth and young adults with type 1 diabetes. He was the first person to receive insulin in Canada, and in this photo here, he's in his early mid-20s, and then he subsequently died at 27 due to complications relating to diabetes. So I guess he was, again, the beginning of a wave where we thought everything was solved, everything was going to be great, and he just began that journey where we realised we had a long, long way to go still. And we still do. Here's one of the young people that has taught me a lot in one of our trials, and he'd been on injection therapy, and essentially a number of the trials we've done recently focuses on those really who have lost hope with conventional therapy. And you can see here, whether you know the numbers or not, but his diabetes is probably the least healthy diabetes in a clinical trial documented in the world. I don't know of any individual with an A1C that high in any technology trial in particular. But he had frequent hospitalizations, and in fact, when we trained him onto our system in one of our trials, he was already unwell, vomiting out the window of the car on the way in, had diabetic ketoacidosis, and I think he lived right on the edge of that his whole life. And so quite clearly, he's at extremely high risk for complications. And I won't dwell on these, but basically we don't succeed with basically all age groups, but in young people, we do particularly poorly. And you can see those red lines there, they're our targets, but only 18% of children in New Zealand meet the targets we set that we know prevent complications. And only 10% of those youth and young adults come anywhere near to meeting those targets. And where does that leave us? Well, the Scottish data suggests you lose 10 to 13 years of life if you're diagnosed in childhood. And the Swedish data is even worse. If you're diagnosed under 10, you lose between 14 and 17 years of life. And I guess the hopeful end of that is, I think, what many people working in the space that I'm in are doing, is that those numbers will completely change. I'd be very hopeful that we won't see that sort of data. So what do we do? And I guess just speeding through it, my interest is in automation. And I guess this is an image many of you will be well aware of. This catching our imagination. This is a self-driving car. But the technology is essentially identical. You need a smart computer. So these cars essentially just are a computer on wheels. You have a smart computer with an algorithm that can take all the information from all the cameras and the sensors, and then it makes the motor go and makes things go. And using technology in diabetes is very similar. We take a pump, which I guess is like the motor in the car. We take a glucose sensor, which is like all the cameras, and then we pump that insulin into the body using the computer to make all the decisions, or in the long run to make all the decisions, at the moment to make maybe 75% of the decisions. And this is just data from 20 people, just showing if you take people who essentially failed conventional therapy over many years, and many of us really find it very difficult to make a pathway forward, using this sort of technology. This is 3 months data, we've got 12 months data, and I can't present it today, but we've got a large randomised controlled trial nationally which shows even better findings than what I'll show you here. But it has massive improvements in HbA1c, even in those who we've not been able to reach before. And essentially what that means is, in all our data, very consistently, you get somewhere between 9 and 10 hours more time in healthy glucose range if you select those who need it most and you apply this technology to them. So we're really excited about that. One of our early technology trials was looking at complications in the skin, and so we collected data from maybe 4 or 5 sites around New Zealand, and at that point, I guess in 2012 or something, there was just under 180 people or so with diabetes using insulin pumps, and they'd been newly funded by the government. Effectively, the plan was that there'd be equal access to that. And I'll just draw your attention here, and I was giving this talk in preventive and social medicine, and as I was preparing for it, oh, that's interesting. Here, hopefully you can see, so here's the top line's New Zealand European, bottom line Māori Pacific. And you just see here in the children, grossly overrepresented with the New Zealand European people. And if you look at the adults, it was even more of a shock. We'd taken all this data from right across the country, and and there was one adult who was non-European using an insulin pump, and I found that pretty shocking. And if you look at the socioeconomic status there, it's very similar. It's independent of ethnicity, but those who had less, those who were more advantaged had far more access to this gear. And so we talked with Leanne Parkin and others, and there was a range of studies that went from here. But some people said, well, they just don't want it. People who are struggling, or people who are non-European might not be interested in this gear. But here's just from one of our recent randomised controlled trials, where all we've done is target people who aren't doing well with traditional therapy. And you can see there we get about 40%, no matter which trial we run, we get about 40% who are non-European. So we feel that the technology, people want it, and I think it's a very, I think the technology is applicable to all people if we give them a chance. And you can see that here, same thing with socioeconomic status. So just to get a bit of a feel what this looks like in terms of applying technology, particularly as we're thinking about how to increase funding and improve access at the moment. If you look at Pharmac-funded technology right now, these are insulin pumps. And you can see here for ethnicity, New Zealand Europeans twice as likely to get an insulin pump as Māori, 3 times more likely to get an insulin pump than Pacific peoples. And again, if you think back to that last slide, they don't have any less interest in this gear. If you look at socioeconomic status, the least deprived far more likely to access insulin pumps than the most deprived. Again, about 2-fold difference there. And age is interesting. And so increasingly we're putting this gear on anyone who'll take it, really. But we were interested in children, but we go well into adults now. But there is a massive difference in adult access to this gear compared to children. And that's a wave coming through to my adult colleagues, and it's going to be really tricky how to manage that in the future. But we need to improve that as well. And here, currently, Pharmac has a range of criteria where we give this gear. And the slide just basically shows that due to their criteria, around 5% of people a year lose access to their insulin pump. And if you look at that, 3 to 5 times more likely if you're a youth or a young adult to lose access, and that basically just highlights that they're really struggling with diabetes. And if you're non-European, you're 2 or 3 times more likely to lose access as well. And again, to me, that's just completely unacceptable. But this is real-time continuous glucose monitoring data. This we've been fighting with the government to fund for quite some time. But this slide here, it's a little tricky with the way this works, but you can see here that this is for Māori. If you're on traditional finger pricking, your HbA1c is very elevated. If you're using real-time continuous glucose monitoring, it's substantially improved. And that happens whatever ethnicity you look at. But this next slide here, I think is the most interesting, that again, just highlighting, if you put real-time continuous glucose monitoring on people, it essentially evens out the disparities. So traditionally Māori are far less healthy than non-Māori, but if you put continuous glucose monitoring on them, or you put our artificial pancreas systems, then we completely remove that whole inequity of outcome. And so, really this remains in type 1 diabetes, but I think moving into type 2, a very substantial equity issue that needs to be urgently corrected. And I'm hoping Pharmac will continue to take steps with that. But the technology is absolutely loved. And this sort of trial, we started with continuous glucose monitoring trials, but moved into automation. But particularly our first trials where you couldn't get it when the trial ended, they're the first trials I've ever done where people cry or, are very distressed at the end of the trial. So, I think that was distressing to us, but also showed we were on the right path at that point. But you can read those quotes there and it really does change people's lives. And so thanks for listening, and happy to take any questions if there's time.
Questions or comments for Ben? Ben, did you tell us what happened to Mr. L's hemoglobin A1C when he went? Because I've never in my, goodness knows how many years of diabetes, seen a hemoglobin A1C, I think quite that high. What had happened? It was 169.
169 or over 17%. So our target is to get that under 7 or, increasingly under 6.5. In this group of people, we've increasingly had to use a laboratory. We used to always use a point of care testing machine, but they max out. You hit this roof that theoretically people aren't really meant to go beyond, but many of the young people we look after max out, so we have to use a laboratory to measure all their measurements. That's how we get those huge numbers. But his HbA1c after 3 months went from 169 down to about 59. And he's sustained that now for 2 years. He's in an extension phase. And again, about 80 to 90% of the people will make those sort of sustained gains. There's we're taking those who were unreached before, and now I guess we're reaching around 80 or 90% of them. There's still a group that we need to find another, way forward for. But
yep.
Ben, thanks for that. Have you worked with or had any success with the more sort of complex automated systems, adding things like glucagon as well to the pumps?
Yeah, that's a really good question. There are a few groups around the world looking at dual hormone therapy. I personally don't have any experience. The outcomes are pretty similar, and at this point it's really quite fiddly. And at the moment, I'm not seeing any great benefit in adding complexity, particularly to those who might be struggling. I think there'll be a place for it in people who absolutely want, the cutting edge, but it does have, there's a lot more to it to run the second hormone. Yeah.
Rachel.
So great talk, thanks Ben. Given the number of years of life lost, admittedly before sort of the pumps really came, but there must be some amazing health economics data that show that these pumps have a phenomenal effect in a health economics sort of model, or not yet?
Yeah, probably. I think some of the health economics around the pump on their own has not been as good as you might think. It's really when you combine the technology. So that's really been a boom area over the last 5 to 8 years. But yeah, and I've changed my thinking quite a bit. At the beginning, I was very pro pump on their own, and people did improve, but not as much as I'd hoped. And I think that's what the literature then showed. And so now, for instance, when someone asks for a pump, I say, well, you're going to use a sensor. And if they say, no, I'm not using a sensor, then often I'm saying, well, why don't we focus on that as our next goal? So I would go, you know, if you couldn't do anything, I'd get a sensor. And then the next thing I'd do is I'd combine them. But I wouldn't go pump before sensor. And that's completely changed the way I think. You know, in the past, I just said get a pump first and then we'll try and get a sensor. But I think the sensor is the most important thing. And that's the thing we don't have funded currently.
Thank you very much, Ben. I was just going to say two things before we move on, but most importantly, number one is to thank you, but I just wanted to mention that some of your work, I think, has been supported by Lions, and that there's a big thing up there which reminds us, but it's good to see that the Lions are represented here, and we'll mention that again this afternoon. So, yeah, thank you for raising that.
Thank you.
So thanks very much, Ben.
Oh, one more, just very quickly.
Oh, I'm sorry, Offa.
Thank you, Ben.
Hi.
Thank you very much for wearing the World Diabetes Day wristband. And if there's any more left on the table, please take one, because it reminds us very much that there is still more to be done, and it's incumbent on us. And thank you very much for your talk on type 1 diabetes, because I'm becoming more and more aware of the number of Pacific children now diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. And it's not just that, it's the lack of awareness about what is available to them and their families, and also the lack of access to the pumps. I know of one family who have the pump because they can afford it. And so they've purchased the pump and supporting their 7-year-old child to manage the type 1 disease. There are other families that cannot afford it. And so they are, you know, having traditional therapy. And, you know, we need to support your fight to ensure that these families have access to the care that they need, the need for proper awareness, and their families need to be supported as well. And it's supporting the self-management, not only of the families, but the wider community. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Offa.